and hand it over to Elise. Thank you.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction, Liz. As I'm getting my screen shared, I'll just introduce myself again. My name is Elise Kramer. I am the main presenter for today's presentation. I also have with me Michael Dilworth. He will hop on later in the session as we start talking about inclusive higher ed, but there he is waving at you all with that bright smile of his. We are, as Liz said, going to talk a little bit about education at the college level for students with disabilities of all kinds. And then we're going to really do a deep dive into inclusive higher ed, which supports students like Michael, which we will, again, chat about as we get closer. So we have a lot to get through in the next hour, less than an hour. With that said, I did hear Liz say, please keep your mic muted, use the chat, and I'm going to go ahead and say you don't have to do that. If you really are someone who has a deep burning question, please feel free to unmute and ask at any point. We do have a Q&A at the end. But if you're anything like me, you're going to forget your question if you wait 45 minutes to ask it. So you are welcome to use the chat. You're also welcome to interrupt me at any point. So with that, let's dive right in. I always like to start with this quote. So this is from a mom whose son is not very verbal. He has kind of a few words he speaks, but for the most part, he uses a communication device or sign language to communicate. And he's kind of that kid that she always thought, like, we'll be lucky if he graduates high school. And then she never thought he would go to college. And then he graduated college. And now he's working a really important job where his employees, his coworkers love him and he loves his job and that kind of stuff. And so this is a quote from his mom. And she said, "The bar has been set high and the students have risen and reached it. They have been presumed competent and their lives changed." And I always like to just kind of start with that little bit of hope, that little bit of inspiration to kind of just share that it really is possible. College is possible, even for the students who sometimes I'll give this type of presentation to parents and they'll say, like, that sounds great for other kids, but not for my kid. And I always like to say, no, really, it could be for your kid too. And so I just think it's important to kind of start with that little bit of encouragement right off the bat before we jump in. So I'm not going to go through this whole slide word for word, just to give a really kind of brief landscape of the picture. So in 1973, that's when Section 504 of the Rehab Act was passed. You may have heard of like a 504 plan in school districts or even in college. And that basically, that law says, at the higher ed level anyway, says that if you are an institution that serves students with a disability, actually what it says is if you are an institution, you have to serve students with disabilities. So if students otherwise could be accepted, they meet the appropriate like ACT, GPA, whatever the application requirements are, they have to be accepted even if they have a disability. So you cannot discriminate against students with disabilities if they could get accepted. 1990, the ADA is passed, which says that, and you have to provide appropriate accommodations for those students. So not only do they have to be welcome on your campuses, but we have to serve them in a more appropriate manner with accommodations. And that is for all institutions of higher ed across the country. So then nothing really happened for the next 18 years. And in 2008, the federal government reauthorized the Higher Education Opportunity Act, which said that institutions can, but they are not required. They can serve students with intellectual disability if they would like to. So in 2008, universities and colleges all across the nation started popping up programs, and Colorado was the last of 3 to do that. So in 2016, our state legislature passed a bill, SB 16196, which provided money for 3 institutions to kind of start pilot programs here in Colorado. And at that point, we had 8 years of learning from other states to do so that we could start right away, kind of avoiding some of the pitfalls that other institutions experienced. And so we popped up some 3 pretty high quality programs right away. That was at Arapahoe Community College, UCCS, and then UNC in Greeley. In 2022, there was another bill passed at the state level that provided even more funding for additional schools to open their doors, and Regis received funding from a private source. So now in 2025, we have 8 institutions, as were 9 years ago, we only had 3, which is really exciting. Now, just to give a brief kind of overview of the differences of what a student might experience, a student with a disability might experience in high school versus what they experience in college. So in high school, students are governed, the law that protects them is the IDEA, which is the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act. The IDEA is set forth to make sure that students are successful in their educational experiences, not just in high school, but all the way from preschool and up into, that was not a typo when in the intro it said PK 21, that is accurate. Students in the state of Colorado can go to school until they're 21 if they meet certain criteria. So all the way through, the IDEA protects students so that they can be successful in their educational outcomes. In college, there is no IDEA. That does not apply once students leave the public school district. So what two laws protect students in college are the ADA and the 504. They do not ensure that students are successful. In college, it is seen that success is a choice. But what they do is they provide students appropriate access so that they can be more successful if they put forth the effort to do so. In high school, the accommodations and modifications probably seem pretty automatic to a student. So when I used to be a teacher, I would get a big file before the school year even started that said, here's all the students that have IEPs and 504s, go. And I had to know what their accommodations and modifications were before I even met the students, knew what they looked like, anything like that. So the students didn't even know that there was this whole behind the scenes, or maybe they didn't know there was a whole behind the scenes part. As we're in college, that is really interactive. If a student does not go and request accommodations and modifications, and then bring that form to their professor saying, I have a right to these elements, they're not going to happen. There is absolutely nothing automatic. Students have to self-advocate for that. We all know in high school, there's tons and tons of structure, right? There's a bell schedule and your classes are assigned and all that kind of stuff. As we're in college, so much less structure, way more downtime that students have to navigate. No one's telling them when to do their homework versus when to scroll through TikTok, right? They got to figure that out on their own. And kind of as a result, in high school, there's not as much choice, and there's much more choice in college. High school, parents or guardians tend to be the primary advocate. So they are in every meeting, they're sending lots of emails, all kinds of stuff that just does not happen in college. In college, parents are not even allowed in meetings unless a student invites them, because a student is the primary advocate. Just a few more to kind of hammer this home. In high school, parents, again, receive all that communication. As we're in college, we say nothing about a student without a student, right? If it's about them, with them, anything like that, like students are going to be involved. There will not be an email chain that a student isn't CC'd into. There's not going to be a meeting that the student doesn't attend themselves, right? If parents are there, it's because a student has asked the parent to be there. In high school, services are always free. In college, some services are free, but a lot require fees. Lots of tutoring and mentoring and all kinds of things like that are not covered by tuition dollars. And then lastly, in high school, there's much more specialized instruction, one-on-one. An IEP will say that a student receives so many minutes in each different category of instruction, and that is direct instruction from a special education teacher. As we're in college, it doesn't really work that way. If a student needs more math support, they have to go to the math center. And if they need more writing support, they go to the writing center, etc. Right? And so it's up to a student to kind of access whatever they need around campuses. So as we go through, I want you to just kind of look at this pyramid. So when I talk about each of these different types of support that exist at the college level, they are additive. So I will begin talking about the traditional disability services, what is open and free to all students with disabilities, and then what happens if that's not enough, and then what happens if that's not enough. So just kind of have this picture of this pyramid in your mind, and we'll come back to it. But just so you can see, they're not really three separate things. The way I'm going to talk about them today will make it look like they're three separate things. But just for a good visual, they're really not. They really are additive. Okay, so these are kind of the three sections. I'm going to go through them each in more detail. So for time, I'm going to blaze through this. If you would like the slides at the end, I'd be happy to send them to you, and you can look through this checklist on your own. So to jump right into traditional disability services. So these are legally mandated at all institutions of higher ed. That's what that ADA says, what I talked about earlier in the presentation, that you have to serve all students with disabilities with accommodations. And part of that law says they have to be for free. There is often on campus, especially if it's a really big college campus, a whole office that will serve students with disabilities. And sometimes it's called like a disability services office or an access office. They might have different names, but there is an office on every campus that does kind of that same thing. On some, especially really small schools, it's probably not an entire office. It might be one person. And at really, really small schools, it might be one person who's only doing disability access, maybe part-time, and maybe part-time is doing like residential res life or something like that, right? So it's not always a whole team of people who are there to support, but there does have to be someone legally who is there to support a wide variety of disabilities. It could be physical disabilities, it could be chronic health, it could be autism, ADHD, mental health, anything that a student would need an accommodation to help make sure that they can access the curriculum in an easier way. So again, these are for students who otherwise would be admitted to the college anyway, per that very first box you looked at on that last slide in 1973, right? The 504. Students have to be admitted if they have a disability. That cannot be why they are not allowed into that university. But students have to meet all essential functions of that course, meaning when they look at the syllabus on the first day of class, they have to be able to meet everything that the syllabus says, right? And they have to, that outline is how it's a guide to this is how you're going to be successful in this course, right? And students have to be able to follow that outline as much as possible with accommodations. Now, sometimes people think, oh, I had an IEP or a 504 in high school. I can just bring that into my college class. No, you cannot. Before students begin classes in college, they have to go to that disability office and they have to receive what's called an accommodation letter. On most campuses is what it's called. And it's something new per that school or that university. So every campus has their own process of creating that letter. And it is up to students to bring that letter to their professors on the first day of class. And if they don't ever tell the professor, hey, I have these accommodations, the professor does not have to provide them because they can't be expected to know about them if the student doesn't share what those accommodations are. So at this point, you might be wondering, okay, great. You've used that word accommodation a lot. What does that mean? Great question. So an accommodation does not change what learning occurs. It only changes how learning is shown. And this is to prepare students for workforce expectations. So a great example might be a professor says you have a week to write a 5-page paper. An accommodation would be, okay, student, you're still writing a 5-page paper because that is the what. But the how might be that you're writing it over 2 weeks instead of 1 week, right? You just need extra time to get all your thoughts in order. Or maybe it's you have, and this would not happen in 2025, but let's just say for argument's sake, the professor said you have to turn it in handwritten. You have to do like a pen written 5-page paper. Maybe an accommodation would be a student could type it, right? Again, the how changes, but the what does not. Because in the average workforce, if you're hired to do a job, what job you're hired to do isn't going to change if you have a disability. You might receive accommodations to do it differently, but ultimately you are expected to get your job done no matter who you are, right? Or they wouldn't have hired you for that role. So there are accommodations that can happen in the classroom, in a testing setting. It could be housing accommodations, like if a student has a physical disability, maybe they can't have a room that has like a bunked bed, for example. Maybe they need a lower bed. That'd be an example of a housing accommodation. And they are often very similar to accommodations that a student receives in high school, but not always. And they're almost never exact. There are going to be some tweaks typically between what is considered an appropriate accommodation in high school versus what's considered an appropriate accommodation in college. So let's say a student does need an accommodation at the higher ed level. The first thing they need to do is self-advocate or self-disclose. If they never go to that office and say, hey, I have ADHD, I have chronic health issue, whatever it may be, no one's going to know. And so they have to do that and provide some sort of some sort of documentation. No one's going to just say like, great, you have ADHD, let's do something about it. You have to prove in some form, and that depends on the disability, what that documentation looks like. But the school does need some form of documentation that is confidential within that disability office. So your professors don't necessarily know that these accommodations are for ADHD or whatever else, but the disability office does. So they do need to see that documentation. But that might change. So a student might start at one school, they show one set of documentation, and then maybe they transfer, and a different campus has different requirements for what counts as allowable documentation. And that's perfectly legal. That's totally fine. They do need to have a clearly stated diagnosis. Some people say, like, well, it says right in my IEP or right in my 504 from high school. That is not automatically accepted. And in fact, it's almost never accepted as enough for the disability documentation. There typically needs to be something from a doctor indicating a clear medical need. And that process is really interactive. So what that means is they're going to talk about what worked for you in high school, what didn't work for you in high school, right? And a student may say like, well, I really needed XYZ. And the disability office may say, great, that really worked in high school. We're not allowed to do that at the college level. Here's what we can do instead. So it really is a conversation to make sure that a student gets what he or she needs based on what the campus can legally provide. And in that process, they will identify what appropriate accommodations are. And then again, just as another reminder, a student will receive a brand new letter. It is not a 504 or an IEP in the same way that it was in high school. All right. So, handful of things just to kind of keep in mind if you have a student who might be going through this process. There can be a length of time. If the student goes to the office today, they're probably not going to have that accommodation letter by this afternoon. So I always recommend that when a student is accepted into college, I would reach out to that disability office pretty much right away and ask them what the timeline is to reach out. They may say you need 2 weeks before the school year starts, or a month before the school year starts, or whatever it is, but you should know what that timeline is well in advance so that you're not walking into that disability office going, hey, I have a test today, I need an accommodation. That's not going to fly. There needs to be some kind of lead time to provide that documentation, to go through that interactive process, all that kind of stuff. There's a lot of open communication with disability office staff. So a student may start the year with one letter of accommodation, and then they say, hey, these things are still not really cutting it. I need more, right? It's up to them to go to the disability office staff and talk about what that might look like. And they need to continually advocate with their professors for those accommodations to be applied in a classroom setting. So a professor may forget that a student needs to take a test in the testing center, for example. It's really important that a student will remind them like a few days or maybe even a week ahead of that test to say, hey, I know we have a test coming up. I'd love to just remind you that I need to take mine in this other setting. What is that going to look like for this particular class? And then there are a variety of procedures that need to be followed. That is up to a student to follow. Like they might need to request time in the testing center ahead of time. So it's not enough maybe to say to a professor, hey, I have accommodations for this test. I need you to provide them, right? It might be on the student to contact the testing center to set an appointment to make that happen. And again, there is some time in advance. These things are not just automatic. There are processes. On smaller universities, those processes can be held up by maybe the fact that it's not an entire office who's doing those things. Maybe it is just one person or a handful of people. On bigger campuses, maybe they do have a whole office, but maybe they also have way more students who need those supports, right? So it's almost never the quickest thing in the world. Sometimes it's a day or 2 days, sometimes it's a week or 2 weeks. And so it's important for students to know kind of what those timelines look like on their own campuses. With that said, students and faculty both have rights and they both have responsibilities, which I will go over on the next slide. So some rights that students have. They have the right to keep their diagnosis confidential. Again, the disability office will need to know what that is, but nobody else on campus needs to know what their disability is unless a student chooses to disclose. A student has a right to be treated equally. Just because they have a disability does not mean that they have different treatment from their professors, from their peers, anything like that. Students can also choose if and when they want to use those accommodations. They can say, hey, I really need accommodations in my accounting class, but I don't need accommodations in my communications class. That's up to them. They can give that accommodation letter to whomever they want, and they don't have to give it to anyone they don't want to. It's also up to them to speak up for their needs and self-advocate. So if a student thinks that accommodations aren't going well, they have a right to share that. And the same thing, the opposite, they have a right to file a grievance against a professor who maybe won't provide accommodations that have been appropriately approved through the office on campus. Likewise, faculty and staff also have rights. So they have a right to receive that accommodation letter with enough time to implement those accommodations. As I've said a few times, some of these things do take time, and it's not fair to a professor to be expected to do something right away. And in fact, they don't have to. They also have the right to discuss accommodations with a student. That is not the same thing as discussing a student's disability. So they don't have that right unless the student, again, self-discloses. But they can say to a student, hey, I'm not so certain that these accommodations, that I understand these accommodations, or that I think they'll work very well for the setting of this particular class structure, or something like that. They have a right to only provide approved accommodations. So a student may say, hey, I think this other thing would work great. And the professor might say, yeah, it might. You need to go get that into your official letter so that I know it's approved. Otherwise, I'm not doing that. And they don't have to. And then they have a right to contact the disability office if they think that those accommodations, what we call alter the essential functions, meaning get in the way of the syllabus. If this accommodation is kind of crossing the line into a modification where it's changing the what a student is expected to learn, that's a problem. And a professor has a right to reach out to the disability services office and say, hey, this thing is overreaching and I don't think I should apply this particular accommodation in my course, and here's why. And they can have that conversation. Now, again, they also all have responsibilities. So students have a responsibility to follow the code of conduct on campus. Just because they have a disability does not give them a right to break behavioral rules on campus, right? Vandalism is not going to be allowed. Sexual harassment is not going to be allowed. All kinds of things in the code of conduct are in that code for a reason, and students still have a responsibility to follow that. They also have a responsibility to follow the essential requirements of the course, which I just spoke about with the faculty and staff. They are responsible to provide an updated letter. So if things change, it could be in the middle of a semester, it could be at the end of a semester, at any point, if things change, it is up to a student to provide a new letter of accommodation. Nothing is automatic at the college level. And then faculty and staff also have some responsibilities. They are responsible to implement all of the approved accommodations. They are also responsible for maintaining confidentiality. That's confidentiality about students' accommodations, even if they don't know what a student's diagnosis is. That also includes confidentiality if they do know a student's diagnosis. So it's not okay for a professor to call a student out in the middle of class and say, hey, so-and-so, I know you need to go to the testing center, go now. That needs to be a private conversation, unless a student has otherwise said, yes, you may do that. But students have a right to keep it confidential that they receive accommodations for any reason and of any kind. Okay, so let's say that's not enough. A student receives accommodations and they're still struggling in college, so they need a little bit more support. So then we kind of add on to this pyramid what we call supplemental services. And not everybody calls it that, but just for the sake of this presentation, right? They're going to supplement what those traditional services offer. So these are, again, for students who are traditionally admitted degree-seeking students. They otherwise are accepted into the university. They just happen to have a disability, right? They can meet all the essential functions of a course. They can be successful, ideally with accommodations only, academically, but maybe they're struggling for another reason, right? And so some colleges, or sometimes it's even private institutions or private companies, can provide additional supports like academic coaching. So maybe that's coaching in like organization or executive functioning or something like that, right? Maybe they're providing peer mentoring. So a peer is kind of helping them work through maybe some organizational issues, or it could be a tutoring or something like that. In a lot of cases, it all kind of boils down to it's supported skill development, and those could be skills of a variety of kinds. So it could be maybe you're academically hanging out on, but the social part of college can get really overwhelming for some students. And so maybe they need help with that element, or they need help setting goals. Like maybe they're like, I'm in college because I know what my long-term goal is because I want to be an engineer or a lawyer or whatever it is. But it's kind of the intermediate goal setting of like, I need to get this assignment done on Friday and this assignment done on Monday and that kind of thing. There can be support in that as well. Now, Not all schools offer these services. As I said, many are private organizations that offer these services. And so what is offered is really, really varied from institution to organization to whatever it looks like. And fees generally apply, and the fees vary greatly too. I have heard some families share that they spent more money in their supplemental services than they did in tuition. Now, that tends to be for really, really intensive services where students are getting coaching many, many, many hours a week, right? So that's a more extreme case. But these are not guaranteed by a university to be offered. They're not required by a university to be offered. And so they almost always do have a fee of some kind because they do go above and beyond the legal requirement of what a campus needs to provide. In Colorado, there are some examples here on the screen. So for example, CSU has a program called Opportunities for Post-Secondary Success that is geared towards students with autism. And so they provide additional support in the dorms so that students get like reminders to do their laundry and, clean sweep their floors and things like that. They also get support in and out of the classroom. So they might get additional tutoring or organization support so that they're turning their assignments in at a reasonable time, even with accommodations. DU has a really similar program called the Learning Effectiveness Program. MSU Denver has Isaac, which is specifically for students with autism. MSU also has what they call Inclusive Higher Education Solutions, which offers academic coaching to any student who needs it for any reason. And then just a handful of external organizations that might offer these types of supports. Untapped Learning does provide support all the way down into elementary school, but all the way up into high school as well. They are executive functioning coaches. College Living Experience provides housing support to students who need it. So maybe they're good in the other kind of academic realms, but they really, really need support living independently. And that's where College Living Experience comes in. So those are just a handful of examples across the state. There are more in the state, there are more in the country. Can't list them all, but those are some kind of heavy hitters. All right, so now to get into inclusive higher ed, which is really my expertise and where Michael is going to come in now to share some of his college experiences as well. So as we're looking at this pyramid, right, this is kind of that top of the pyramid. So students receive all of the supports that other students have received, and maybe that's still not enough and they still need more. So these are only offered at select institutions. Colleges and universities are not required to provide inclusive higher ed if they don't want to. The whole point of inclusive higher ed is for students who do not meet traditional entry criteria. So these are students who need an entirely alternative admissions pathway, typically because they have an intellectual disability or other disability that means that they could not meet the traditional entry criteria, right? These are often students who don't take ACTs and SATs. Their courses in high school might be pass-fail, and so maybe they don't have a GPA, for example, right? Some do. But these are specifically for students who would not be able, if they applied to college through a traditional route, they probably would not be accepted. Courses are all inclusive, so they are in the same courses with the same professors and the same peers as everybody else on campus. These are not segregated special ed courses that happen to be on a college campus. These are college students taking college courses. However, in addition to accommodations, they also receive modifications, which I'll go into more depth in the following slides. As a result of those modifications, so as I mentioned when I talked about accommodations change the how but not the what. Modifications do actually change the what. So what students' learning outcomes change to meet their cognitive level. And as a result, they're not doing the same depth and breadth of work and learning that a degree-seeking student is. So these students earn a certificate of higher education rather than a degree. And there are all kinds of supports offered, and so there are always, always, always fees. Students are supported from staff and peer mentors in what we call the 4 pillars. Those are academics, social development, career development, and independence. Now, I'm not going to read through all of these, especially because Michael's going to talk a lot about them. But kind of the big thing to note here is that all 4 of these yellow bubbles are the same size, and they're all interconnected with that darker ring on the outside. And so what we see is that not one of these is more important than any other. They are all equally important. They're all equally supported. So these are for students who need academic support, of course, but they also need social support or to learn how to live independently, or maybe they need support learning what jobs are out there and how do you get there, right? And maybe they have job coaches on site to help them do that, right? And so this is to provide students all of the help and all of the support they need, not only to be successful while they are in college, but to be successful after college in meeting their post-grad goals in every one of these 4 domains. All right, so in Colorado, we have 8 schools that offer inclusive higher ed. Michael is our proud representative of the Office of Inclusive Services at UCCS. And that is in Colorado Springs. They have on-campus living in apartments that are technically actually not on campus. But right across the street from campus. I thought they were on campus when I first visited. But historically, students there have lived in apartments. Starting next school year, they will also have the option to live in the traditional kind of rugged dorm experience if they want it. And it takes students there 4 years to graduate. Arapahoe Community College has the Elevate program. That is in Littleton. That's a commuter campus for everybody. That is a 3-year program. So even though it's a community college, it does take students 3 years to get through, and we'll talk about why in a few slides. Regis Global Inclusive Program. So that's in that northwest kind of corner of Denver, almost towards Arvada. They do have on-campus living if students want it. They can live in dorms or they can commute. They're unique in that they have a 1-year option, a 2-year option, a 3-year option, and a 4-year option, with their specific certificate credential changing depending on how long they are there. And then UNC has the GOAL program, Go On and Learn. That's in Greeley. Students there live in pretty traditional rugged dorms. They are required to, even if they do live in the Greeley area, they have to live in dorms there to be part of the GOAL program. And that is a 4-year school option. Now, all 4 of these schools have what we call CTP, which is the Comprehensive Transition and Post-Secondary Program status. That's a really fancy way of saying that the federal government has said they will provide financial aid in the form of grants and in the form of work study. Students, unfortunately, are not eligible for federal loans because they are not degree-seeking students. And they all earn that same comprehensive higher education certificate, which truly is a meaningful outcome. Students have to meet graduation requirements and take specific courses and all kinds of things to earn that. That's not something that's just like handed over as a congrats, you did it. It is offered by the same campus office on campus that does grant degrees. So it is weighty, it is meaningful. And the cool thing about them all offering that same certificate is that courses can be transferred between programs. So let's say a student starts at ACC, they live in the Littleton area and they want to stay at home for a year. And then maybe they decide they're ready to live independently, so they transfer to maybe UNC Goal. They can take their courses and their credits with them between programs that offer that same certificate. CSU has the RAM Scholars Program in Fort Collins. That is a 3-year program that is really heavily focused on agriculture and experiential learning. So students are taking courses in horticulture, in animal husbandry, farming practices, all kinds of things that prepare students there for the jobs that are available in Larimer County, which are often agriculturally and rural jobs. And so that's what that program is for. It just launched last school year for the first time, so they don't offer on-campus living yet. They will open their dorms to RAM Scholar students when they're ready to provide that type of support. They just don't want to bite off more than they can chew without being able to do it successfully, and they're not ready for that yet. MSU Denver has the Inclusive Higher Education Solutions kind of umbrella office under which they have inclusive support services, which is their inclusive higher ed option. MSU Denver is a commuter campus, for those of you who don't know, and that is a 4-year option. Lamar Community College in the southeast corner of the state has Cultivate. They do have residential living as a school because it's so rural, but it will be open to Cultivate students probably in like fall of 2027. This is their first school year open, so kind of same thing with CSU with that. And that's a 3-year school. And then last but not least, Pikes Peak State College has the Aspire Scholars Program in Colorado Springs, also a commuter campus, and takes students 3 years. Now, all 4 of these programs are working to get that CTP in place, which, as a reminder, is that federal financial aid designation. And they all have that same certificate. So again, courses are all transferable between any of these programs. Now, how would a student access these types of services? So once they are admitted, there is an orientation process, which typically includes students and families. So families are much more heavily involved in inclusive higher ed than they might be for a traditional college student. Students will go through person-centered planning, or at some campuses they call it person-driven planning, which kind of takes the place of that accommodation interactive process. This is what it looks like for these students. So they go through a whole process where they talk about what do they need in each of those 4 pillars of support. So this plan will include their goals and how and needs to meet those goals, and in academics, in social skills, in independence, and in career development. So it'll include all kinds of things that help them prepare for their life after college. Now, all of their courses directly prepare them for whatever that career goal is. So one student might say, my career goal is to be in education, and another student might say, my career goal is to be a photographer. They're going to be in very different classes. And so based on their career goal, they will select an area of study, and then from that, choose appropriate courses. Their staff will coordinate peer mentor support, creating a schedule for when and how students will meet with peer mentors. That could be before class, it could be during class, it could be after class, it could be at social events, it could be to help support their housing needs, all kinds of things, but it is an interactive process to determine accommodations and modifications in all 4 areas of support. Okay, Michael, now it's time for you to come on in. First of all, if you want to tell us what your name, where you went to school as a reminder, and then answer, how did peer mentors support you and how did staff support you when you were in college?
My name is Michael Dilworth, and I graduated in college at UCCS, and
What year did you graduate?
I graduated in the year of 2022.
Awesome. How did peer mentors support you on campus?
My mentors and my professors had helped me achieve my own goals, and they had shown me how to be independent by doing my homework, and they helped me with making sure I have the proper skills to do my homework and get my stuff organized, and trying to live on my own and to actually have fun with all my friends and trying to get connected with them more.
Awesome. And how did staff support you?
And the staff support me they would support me in my studies by helping me to access the technology to see my progress there, and they have shown me different things about myself through all the classes and all the um sessions they have there for each student like me, and they have like special curriculums so that I can actually fill out all the paperwork, and they actually have support doing that though.
Awesome. Thanks, Michael. We'll hear more from Michael in a few slides. Excellent. All right, so as I said, we're going to dive more into modifications. So if accommodations change how learning occurs or how a student shows their learning, modifications change what learning occurs. So this adapts the course expectations to meet a student's cognitive level. And you might be thinking to yourself, maybe you are a professor or you are an instructor, in a college level. And maybe you are an excellent expert in, like, let's say chemistry, but you might not know anything about how to provide a modification to a student like Michael. And that's very fair. There's no reason why you should know that unless you've gone through special education. So that's why we have program staff who implement the modifications themselves. So they will email a professor and say, before semester starts, hey, send me your syllabus. And then they'll email back and say, great, for Michael, this is what his assignments will look like instead, right? And so and they may even send over an example rubric of, like, you can grade against this rubric rather than what you're used to grading against. So the professors are still doing the grading and deciding whether a student has met the course outcomes based on what the program staff has decided those outcomes should be. But it's not that they are doing all of it, right? There's a lot of support in that happening. So some examples of what that looks like at the classroom level, they might have shorter assignments. So I'm going to go back to you have a 5-page paper. Michael, do you think you could write a 5-page paper? Maybe not. Yeah, we're not quite sure. So maybe Michael would write like a 5-paragraph paper, or maybe he would turn in a slideshow of 5 slides where he could put in a lot of pictures to show his learning. Or maybe he's turning in a recording of him just talking about his learning, or he's doing a graphic organizer of his reading instead of maybe writing like a whole discussion board on Canvas about his understanding of that reading, right? Those are just some examples of modifications where the depth and breadth of the learning is shortened, it's lessened. In terms of testing, maybe students have fewer questions. Maybe it's a multiple choice test, and instead of 4 answer choices, there's 3 answer choices. Or the wordings of the questions is simplified a little bit. Or maybe it's an alternate format. So instead of sitting down and filling in bubbles or writing a whole essay for a test, maybe it's all verbal. For housing, students might receive additional support from NRA. Maybe they get additional peer mentor support, right? So they have a lot more changes to meet their needs that go above and beyond what a traditional student with a disability would receive in the form of an accommodation. So Michael, I want you to share. I just gave some examples of what you could experience, but I want you to share what you did experience. What were some of your accommodations and modifications while you were at UCCS?
When I was in UCCS, the things that I have learned are getting my things organized, and I had a lot of things that I would do. Like, I would even make sure that I get the homework ready, and I make sure that I have um the things ready to actually get me involved in other activities. And they had a lot of support through showing me where things are, and they had helped me by making sure that I get um the work done, and actually tell me what to do. If I were lost or something, I would just call them and say I need help though, and I would actually have that help as well. And actually, it's a life changer for me when I have those experience of having the friends that I can, like, have fun with, and making sure I have all the um things for me to actually have the modifications. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you, Michael. So I heard lots and lots of peer mentor support is kind of how to sum up your experience, right? Peer mentors are really there to make sure in classes you are following along, they help you take notes, they help you submit things online, all kinds of things like that. Awesome. All right, let's keep chugging. So this is an example certificate. This is not a real student. This is literally like a computer-generated example from Arapahoe Community College. But just so you can kind of see a few things. So they all will note that courses are modified and or they were enrolled in a modified program. So this example right at the top says it's a certificate. It says that it's in comprehensive higher education, which otherwise would say it's in like, you know, photography or whatever it is, right? This is the example. So each student takes only a few courses per semester. So you'll see that these courses are across the whole course catalog. So a student taking, for example, courses in education is not going to be in the same courses or many of the same courses as a student taking classes in like photography, for example, except for their kind of prereqs are going to be slightly different. Those are more likely to have other inclusive higher ed students in them, where these are courses that are specifically kind of put throughout a student's college experience to help prepare them for life after high school, or I'm sorry, life after college in a way that other students might not need. So for example, like interpersonal communication might not be a required course for a traditional college student, but for a student with an intellectual disability, interpersonal communication might be a skill set that they really need to ramp up in. So not only are they receiving support in that from their staff and peer mentors, but they're also taking a whole course in that. That's one example, right? To help make sure that they understand different skills to help prepare them for life after college and in jobs. As a reminder, those modified courses are only transferable to other programs. And even before I get Michael to this, just something that I'm often asked. Parents often will ask me, if my kid starts on the modified track, can they then transfer those courses to a degree course? And the answer is no. If students are taking courses for modified credit, they're only for modified credit. You cannot take a modified course for degree credit. Those are two separate things. So what some students will do, if they're ready for it, and not every student is they'll maybe take a course modified and then they'll repeat the same course non-modified. And so they're working towards a degree on a really, really slow track, which can be helpful for students even beyond this. So traditional students, like you'll see, they're only taking 2 courses a semester. Sometimes it's 3 courses a semester. And that is considered full-time for inclusive higher ed. But if you want to be a degree seeking student, sometimes there's additional kind of steps that it might take to even make that happen. All right, so Michael, I want you to share what you studied and what courses you took to help get there. And you are still muted, my friend. There you go.
The area of study that I studied in UCCS is human services, and that was my major there. In the classes that I have been taking through um the human services major that I took was in theater and in human services and in capstone, and the things that I do in my classes that I do is I take notes, I take a lot of homework in, and I have I make sure that I get the things in on time, and I would even have the services for making sure I have all the jobs that are good. I even had taken some classes that are online, and I get the service by making sure that I get all the formats um organized, and I get all um the things in. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you, Michael. All right, I'm looking at the clock and we only have a few minutes, so I'm going to try to blaze through so that we can get to a little bit of Q&A with Michael. So Michael, I'm going to skip these next few questions for you if that's okay. So just so you can kind of generally look at this, I know this is hard to read. These numbers are very small. This orange line, this is the general ID population, percent employed. The blue line, people with ID who have attended college. With the exception of COVID, they are much, much, much more likely to be employed if they've gone to college than if they haven't gone to college. There's also data that shows that they are paid significantly more money in those jobs. So Michael, again, I'm going to skip these questions. People can ask them during the Q&A if they want to know about your jobs. But just to kind of show, in Colorado, we do track our graduation outcomes, and we've tracked our grads in 2023, 2024, 2025, and our average employment rate in Colorado is 83%, which is significantly higher than even the national average of students with ID who've gone to college across the nation. So we're doing really well at this here, which is exciting. With that, I do want to give at least a handful of minutes for the Q&A portion. And in fact, I'll even stop sharing my screen for that so we can all see Michael's face much bigger. I do see that one question in the chat. So does CU Boulder not offer these services? They do not. The only schools in the state that offer those services are the 8 that I mentioned. The CU system has kind of decided that they want to concentrate their efforts onto the one campus at UCCS to make sure that they're being offered really, really well, at least one place in the CU system. And if need arises down the line, they may be amenable to opening their doors to these services later. But for now, we are not there. So great question in the chat, Ted. What other questions does anyone have for me or for Michael? Can students at CU still get accommodations? Yes, that is legally required at all institutions, that they have to provide accommodations. When the modifications come into play, that's where it is not required. So good question. And you are welcome to unmute and ask me or Michael questions directly.
I have a question.
Please.
For CU Boulder, I'm just kind of curious why students who come in who might have been under like a 504 or an IEP throughout their educational journey are asked to follow the medical model at CU Boulder as opposed to like a universal design sort of approach. It sounds to me like you have to have an official doctor's diagnosis.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just curious, like, how would an older, like an adult basically, who has maybe never had a medical diagnosis because they were diagnosed by non-medical doctors, right? There's tutors, there's even entire schools like Hillside School where you can go, you don't need a diagnosis to go there. They identify these kids as dyslexic outside of the medical situation. So why does CU go to the medical model if we understand that there's this huge population of people who can benefit from that universal design approach? I'm just a little confused about that.
Yeah, that's a really great question. So the short answer is because that is what is legally required. So the 504 and the ADA outline certain requirements. And so they outline kind of who can be served and under what circumstances. And so there has to be a diagnosis. Different campuses require that diagnosis to look different ways. So some do say it has to be from a doctor. Others say it can be from, maybe it's like adaptive scores that were done from an educational psychologist, right? So it doesn't at every campus have to be from a doctor specifically, but students do legally have to provide some form of documentation from a source that the school decides what that source is. I don't know at CU Boulder what that is, and maybe Liz, you can speak to that more than I can.
I'm probably not the right person to answer that question. I'm sorry.
No worries.
But do we have anyone here from Disability Services? No, but we can definitely get back to that question and investigate it for you.
That is a great question.
I'd love to hear, yeah, how they approach that, because on the website it says documentation, and sometimes it's asked for a doctor's notes, but you know, if someone's thinking about going to see a Boulder and they don't have a medical diagnosis, that could be a pretty significant financial barrier to them.
Yeah, that's one of the major barriers that are often identified in these situations. But I'm curious if there are some case-by-case situations, but I really don't know. And not being a official person there, I would not want to try to guess about that. But yes, I mean, it is a question of how people do get considered that they qualify. So. But we are unfortunately out of time. I can stay if Elise and Michael can, and thank you both so much for your presentation today. If people have questions for Elise, and if you have time, we could stay for a few minutes. I also just wanted to make sure everyone could see that our agenda for the rest of today, our final day of the symposium, I put it in the chat. And thank you everyone for attending. Elise, do you want to take any more questions, or are you out of time?
No, I'm happy to stay if anyone has anything else you'd like to share. So, okay, just to share in the chat, Hunter says, on the staff side, you need a doctor's note to get accommodations through the ADA compliance office. It is different for students, but we are up against some federal laws here. So we can only do, campuses can only do so much. They have some leeway, but not as much as maybe we would hope.
Well, and one thing that occurred to me when I was hearing the question, and maybe I misunderstood, but a universal design approach to instruction is different than an official accommodation, right? So like those are individualized and, worked with, the student gets worked with disability services, and it's a whole different process. UDL is much more of an individual instructor, professor, educator, instituting universal design practices in their classroom. And that's highly encouraged. But sometimes, difficult to do, or people aren't educated enough. But I'm sure Elise can speak better to that than I can.
You said it perfectly. Does anyone have any other questions or thoughts or anything at all?
I would just like to say it was really interesting to hear you talk about the different programs on the different campuses. And that's so important to know. And also just knowing about this topic, which I really hadn't heard very much about, honestly. So thank you so much, both of you, for sharing today.
Absolutely. Thank you for having us. I will put my email and phone number in the chat. So if anyone has any other questions and you don't want to ask publicly, you are welcome to reach out to me on your own time. There's my information in the chat.